I would like to introduce our second keynote speaker, Mr. Dick van Gameren, who is an outstanding architect and urbanist and as well as a professor at Delft University of Technology in the Faculty of Architecture and the Built Environment, where he heads the chair of Dwelling. He's a partner in the renowned Meccano studio. He participated in many groundbreaking Dutch housing projects, widely reproduced in literature such as Iburg, Idok, Funenpark, Borneo Island in Amsterdam, and many others. He's a winner of many architectural competitions, including the Netherlands Embassy in Ethiopia, and also in Poland in competition on Museum of Warsaw Łazienki Park. His scientific interests concern, among others, on problems of affordable housing in rapidly expanding cities across Africa and Asia. He is also the editor of scientific magazine Dash, Delft Architectural Studies on Housing. Professor van Gameren, please share your knowledge and experience with us.
So I start with this image. It's a little bit of a change of atmosphere after the castles in the Dutch river landscape. But yeah, I start with this image because I think housing design, planning of housing, and the urban design, the planning and designing of residential neighborhoods is the greatest challenge we face as architects, as designers. And we talk a lot nowadays in society about climate change, but I think we should also probably on an equal level of intensity discuss the issue of housing and urbanization, because I think that's also one of the, yeah, as I said, challenges we face all over the world. And this is of course obvious. What we see happening in what we call nowadays the global south, in Southeast Asia and Africa, the exploding urbanization and leading to cities that from our much more comfortable Western perspective, of course, seem to be completely unlivable. And it was also in, talk about habitat, 2 years ago there was a UN Habitat conference in Quito, a conference that only happens every 20 years, a very big event, and there in the final statement, as a United Nations conference should send out to the world, they also said that the issue of housing is one of the most important issues to face the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. I don't know if you're familiar with these goals. There are 20 of them, and together they try to bring more equality and health and quality of life to the world as a whole. And housing there is the key issue. This is an image of Mumbai, and I don't have to explain, of course, what you see and what the issues we have to address when talking about housing. The incredible also contrast between the rich in their towers and the other half of the 20 million people living in Mumbai who live in informal settlements. And it's not only, let's say, what we see, but we can also see that the solutions that are being thought out, also by architects, are not always, let's say, really improving solutions. This is a typical example of a Mumbai slum replacement project, where the slums are replaced with these slabs that stand apart only 4.5 meters. And of course it's the housing, but it's, stop, let me see.
Don't press this one. This one, lower left.
Okay. No, it already stopped working, I'm sorry. Oh, now it works again. Yeah. And it's of course not only housing, the buildings itself, but also how they work together as a neighborhood and become part of the city. And there, of course, infrastructure comes in, which is another big issue if you talk about housing and building cities, because infrastructure tends to destroy the city instead of connecting it. Well, just one, I don't want to bore you with too many figures, but I think this is really a very simple graphic, but it shows the challenge that we have to face, because in the next 30 years, and probably you all know these figures, 2.5 billion people will also move to the city. So in 30 years, we have to create places for people to live, for 2.5 billion people in urban conditions. It's a challenge that's probably almost impossible to face, let alone to solve. And it's not only in the global south, or as we used to call it, the developing world. We see similar issues in our own part of the world. This is an image of London, which I think is a beautiful depiction of what's happening there. You see a typical English housing estate built in the 50s, time of the welfare state, and in the background you see big capitalism coming up, threatening the affordable housing. And indeed, in London, a lot of this affordable housing is simply disappearing, being demolished and replaced by high-end housing. And I want to stay in London to show you a project we've been working on in the last 4 years. But also because I think this project is interesting, because it's connected to history, and it also shows that the challenges we face today are of course not new. The urbanization is an older phenomenon, and also the fact that cities have to deal with slums, with extremely bad living conditions for those who cannot afford something better. And we can maybe also learn from how these issues were addressed in the past, and also how often the solutions failed. This is an image of a typical London working class neighborhood at the end of the 19th century. And this image probably shows even more what was happening in these areas. They were completely overcrowded. Large families living in one room, no sanitary facilities, no sewage. It looks maybe quite cheerful, although the woman on the right is not looking that happy. But of course, these living conditions were really very bad in the Victorian times for the working class. And of course, this was discussed. People saw these circumstances. But, and then again, it seems almost like it is today again. The state said, the city, well, the free market will take care of that. In the end, the market will solve these issues and will come up with solutions. But that didn't happen in the 19th century. So the first projects that actually tried to address the housing crisis of the 19th century were philanthropic institutions. And one quite well-known one that even still exists today, I'm coming back to that later, is the Peabody Trust. The Peabody Trust was formed around 1860 by an American millionaire who had factories in the United Kingdom, was very rich, and he gave 500,000 English pounds. At that time, that was an incredible amount of money, with the intention to improve the living conditions of the working class. And the trustees of the trust decided to use the money to build housing, to really start indeed improving the living conditions of the working class. And they developed, and maybe now for architects we think that is really wrong to do, one standard solution that they kept building for 40 years, the so-called Peabody building. You can see it here, but in the end, I think it was a very successful way of dealing with these problems, because what they did in these 40 years, they improved every time a new project was built a little bit based on the experience of what was built before the project. And I think that's also an essential element of housing design. Housing design is not about let's try out another new idea today, but it's really building upon experience. And that's what the Peabody Trust did. And they were very clever in making this design. It was, by the way, designed by an architect called Derbyshire, Henry Derbyshire. And he made a design based on the idea of the lowest possible cost for maintenance. So the detailing and the materials were all very well chosen and well made. And that, I think, in the end determined the success of these projects. Because this is a picture taken 2 years ago of a project that was built 140 years ago. Of course, there is maintenance, but it still looks really okay. And I think it's also about the scale, because these projects were never too big. That's another very important issue. So this standard block was repeated 5, 6 times, and that was it more or less. Always around, if the space was available, these central courtyards. And now, of course, with mature trees, these are really very pleasant places. And if you now have them imprinted on your eyes, if you walk through London, you will see them everywhere. You hardly notice them if you don't know them, because they're very innocent. But in the end, quite successful. The plans are also very simple, but they were also flexible, because within this basic design that was repeated many times over 40 years, you could still create a certain differentiation of smaller and bigger units. And that's an element I will also come back to later. And here's another example of one of these Peabody estates in central London. So first the philanthropic institutions that started to deal with the housing issue, but later, around 1900, the beginning of the 20th century, the city itself started to take care of the housing in the city. And that's when the project of council housing started, and creating, especially in the beginning, beautiful projects like this Millbank estate near the Tate Gallery in London. But the urbanization at that time of London, of course, continued. The city started to grow, and you could say that there always was a housing crisis. There always was a need for affordable housing. And if we look at this image, maybe you won't believe it, but this was taken in 1970. That's not that long ago. But then again, or still, people in London were living in slums, in slum-like conditions. This is another image from this series of 1970 people working in a makeshift kitchen on a staircase. Extremely sad living conditions in 1970. And of course, this was still the time of the English or European welfare state. The city wanted to address this, and in fact, the London Council at that time had the largest architectural office of Europe. Hundreds of architects all working on housing, trying to deal with these issues. And at the end of the 1960s, they planned and designed what had to be really the showcase of their projects, let's say really the brilliant future of housing for London. It was the project for Thamesmead. And here you can see an image of the first part of the project, finished around 1970. And of course, it's nice to compare these two images, who were taken in the same year. On the left, someone actually pushing a real baby, and there a child playing with her doll in this new brave world of Thamesmead. But in the end, the Thamesmead project proved to be not that brave. This is an image of the master plan of Thamesmead, designed at the end of the 1960s, and really a state-of-the-art project for that time. And of course, full of ambitions and ideals. Oh, sorry, I'm going too fast. I have to go back. Can you go back a few? Yeah, yeah. There's not a pointer, huh? Or is there?
The lower one is the next one.
Ah, yeah, no. Yeah, no, I have it, yeah. So it's the red dot. So the basic idea of the master plan was to build walls of housing, starting with a 4-story wall here in the south, and then continuing, it's a giant structure, to a wall of 12 stories high, facing the River Thames. This is the river, and this is also where I'm pointing, is the north side. So it's on the south bank of the Thames, between Greenwich and Bexley. So you had this big wall, habitable wall, and behind that were smaller, low-rise neighborhoods. So it was already a departure from the idea of the 1960s, when the English were only building tower blocks. This was already a mix of high-rise, only 12 stories, and of low-rise housing. Yeah. Here you can see a drawing of the master plan, and two things are very clear on this image. Infrastructure was very important. They started building 2 highways just through the middle of the area, which was, of course, in retrospect, a very bad idea because it immediately bisected the whole development. And also, but that's maybe more attractive for shooters, a set of canals and lakes, because this was marshland, so it also had a function to drain the marshes. And yeah, one back. And it's going too fast. And as I said, it was built and advertised with very honorable ideals. So to create a new community, employment, very important for a new town, was also implemented. And it was really seen as the town of tomorrow. And this is one of the first images taken of the first part built. And we are standing in one of the tower blocks of 12 floors, but what I want to point out is this chimney, because this is where the whole project started. It was a prefab concrete factory, because the whole project was designed in prefab concrete. Yeah, I always touch the wrong button and then disaster strikes, but it's okay. It was imported from France, probably you know, because France was the pioneer in prefab. Even Eastern Europe at that time imported prefab systems, or the ideas, from France. Well, here it immediately completely failed. It was badly built, the details were unimaginably bad. But it looked quite nice in the beginning. It's a typical brutalist project. This was the era of brutalism, 1970. A very sculptural and, yeah, could say quite interesting architecture, if you like, brutalism. And it was designed as one big megastructure. Everything was connected. Another typical planning idea of that time, to connect everything on a first floor level with pedestrian walkways. Well, this had one reason, you could say a more objective reason, because it was in this marshland. The idea was that if there was high water, if the Thames would flood, you could escape on that pedestrian level. But I think it was just an excuse of the architects, because all the architects at that time loved to work with this, let's say, 2 ground levels, one for cars and one for the pedestrians. We have examples also in the Netherlands of this. And here you can see an image. This was one of the first inhabitants of Thamesmead. And he is not sitting on his balcony. No, this is the walkway. And his official front door with the letterbox and the doorbell is on this level. So the ground level was only made for the cars. And I think we should also not maybe ridicule this too much, because at this time the problem of accidents in traffic, fatal accidents, was really a big societal issue. Fortunately, it has much improved, but at that time this was really seen as a very important aspect also to separate these slow traffic from fast traffic. Well, anyway, it's the first happy inhabitant. And what was very good also, they immediately started building schools. So immediately a community started to grow in this area. But that was only the first 2-3 years. Because, as I said, things went wrong. And now I think something went wrong with the slides. Can you go back? Can you go back a few? No? More? One more? No, going back. Yeah, no, maybe I made a mistake then, I guess. So I will continue. Doesn't matter. This is how it looks now. And it looks really very sad. And there are a lot of reasons why it's looking so sad. So I should not talk for hours about this. But, well, certainly there's the lack of maintenance. And that's, of course, the end, you could say, of any project. The maintenance was also very problematic because it was so badly built. As I said, the prefab system failed. Then another thing happened, which is more a political thing. We all know Margaret Thatcher and the Thatcher years and her adagium, the right to buy. She thought that every Englishman, every English family should own its own house. So this whole project, which was all, let's say, social housing owned by a housing corporation, was put up for sale. So everybody living there could buy his house. And that was another reason for the downfall of the project, because like half of the housing dwelling units are now privately owned. But then, when people wanted to move out, they found out that they couldn't sell their house because the people who might be interested to buy it, they couldn't get a mortgage because the English banks refused people to give a mortgage because it was such a bad area already at that time. So what people did, they moved out and they just rented out their house. So it really became what David Gameren once called a sinkhole, a sink estate. Well, there are many more things, but you can also see, of course, that because of these different ownerships, a lot of very bad renovations happened. You can see it here as well. And the housing corporation that still owned half of the housing did nothing except for putting up signs, warning and forbidding anything that could happen there. Even in this concrete jungle, they put up a sign that horse grazing is not permitted. And this is how it looks today. The housing corporation that owned it started already a process of demolition because, they found that the houses are in such a bad state it's impossible to save them. They started the demolition process and then they stopped. And then the government stepped in finally, the City of London, and they ordered the owner, the failing housing corporation, to sell the project for almost nothing to the Peabody Trust, because the city had still confidence in the Peabody Trust. And this was also at a moment, I showed this image before, that this housing crisis in London became a big political issue, because people were really kicked out of the city. If you lived here, there's no protection for renters in London anymore. So the people even said in some of the boroughs of London, oh, move to Birmingham, there you can still find a place that is affordable. And this became, of course, a big political issue. Also, how developers really exploited the system, because they were still forced to build some affordable housing when they rebuilt a project, but they really managed to do that in the most minimal way. So there was a lot of unrest and turmoil about this. And then the eye of the city fell on Thamesmead, this almost forgotten, failed new town on the edge of London. And an important thing, important reason why their eye fell on this was that this area will in 1 year become very well connected to the city, because that was of course one of the other problems of this new town, that it took more than an hour to get to the center of London. But with the new, you might have read about this, the new Queen Elizabeth line, it's a very original name of course, but it's a new railway line connecting the west to the east of London. And the end station on the east side will be here. So in Thamesmead, and that means that within 1 year, the traveling distance to the city of London will be 15 minutes instead of more than 1 hour. So it certainly, the value increases enormously. And so that was a main trigger also to look at this area. But then they were confronted with all the problems, the lack of maintenance, the fact that the original owner already started a very bad demolition and reconstruction program, immediately failing already after 2 years. And of course the fact that half of the units is privately owned. So then how can you start restructuring, rebuilding this part of London? Well, if you have a lot of money. So the mayor of London, he put £200 million aside to buy everybody out. And then you can really start the reconstruction of this area. And of course, with the economic and financial power of London, London could do this. And that's where we came in. So we were selected by, it's a long introduction, but I think quite a fascinating history. That's where we came in. When the Peabody Trust selected us to work with a London-based architectural firm to make a master plan for the first step of the redevelopment of this area. And two very important things in the brief given to us were, well, first that, of course, we started the discussion, should you not save the existing brutalist, quite iconic housing? They said, no, we cannot save it anymore, it's too bad, and we saw it with our own eyes that indeed you could not save it. But also to triple the density, because that's of course the economic basis of the whole project. By tripling the density, you can, let's say, earn money with the part that is market housing to build again the original amount of social affordable housing back. So it will also be possible for all the people living in the area to go back. They will get a new house. Well, for the people living there, is that really very a wonderful chance, because they will get a new house with not smaller, probably bigger, and with more quality. So that's, I think, where really the social engagement of the Peabody Trust comes in. And, oh, I touched the wrong button again. Sorry. It's too small, my fingers are too fat. Yeah. Yeah, you can see on the left side an aerial image. So we started with a project to rebuild that spine building, that wall building that started here in 4 floors, and it was never finished. It never reached in the end the River Thames, because the project failed so soon. But rebuilding that, but in a very different way. So we said, okay, let's take out that mega structure with that pedestrian deck level and try to create a more urban environment that is really connected to its surroundings, because this mega structure of Thamesmead was a completely isolated enclave. Also one, I think, of the big problems that it had. I think a housing project can only be successful if it's part of its surroundings. So that's where we started, by defining new connections, a new system of roads, but just on the street level, also for pedestrians and cyclists. and not designing it as one megastructure. You can see it a bit vaguely on the left, but as a series of clusters of building blocks, you could say, that by their variation in shape and also by the way they adapt to the existing conditions of its borders, of the edges, to create a series of squares in different shapes and forms. In a way, it's like Gordon Cullen, townscape. And on the left again, an image of what the project was. So you see the blue line is the traffic line, and then you had the pedestrian deck level of the spine block, the red line, going from nowhere to nowhere, and how we want to replace that with connections that really lead, for example, to the railway station or to the northern part of Thamesmead, to the neighborhoods on the east side of Thamesmead, and also connect that with the main traffic artery. And this is a view of the urban scheme. So it's a drastic change of the original setup, but it was also necessary because by doing this we were indeed able to triple the existing density. So from 500 dwellings that have to be demolished, we will build 1,500. But we decided not to go really for high-rise and to keep the new buildings on a maximum height of the existing tower blocks. Because there was also a discussion, and still is, about whether the tower blocks should be saved and not demolished. And we thought, okay, then we can also integrate the existing in the new. I think that's also important, that it's not a clash of the old and new, but that you even still respect what's already there and will be preserved, and that it will work together. That's another thing we explored in our project. And here you see some sketches I made of this new, let's say, townscape for this spine of Thamesmead. And this is the idea for the housing typology, the clusters of building types. And we said, let's retain that one ideal that was present in the original Thamesmead plan, that it's a mix of apartments and townhouses. Because I think this mixing of types, smaller, larger ones, is also very important to create a residential neighborhood with a quality, and also to make it a neighborhood that will stand time. That there is already from the beginning a differentiation in types. I think that's also something that we really made a lot of mistakes with in the post-war period, building too much of the same at the same time. Okay, and well, you could also say that this clustering of buildings around the courtyard that we proposed relates back to the original Peabody buildings, a standard, very cheap type, but creating good spaces. Yeah, strangely enough, I have to say that. So there were two slides missing. I don't know what happened, but they are quite funny, because one was of Queen Elizabeth opening the shopping center of Thamesmead, everybody very happy. And then the next image, maybe we can find that at the end, was a still of a movie, Clockwork Orange, of Stanley Kubrick. I guess quite a few of you know this movie. It's a horrible movie. It's very violent, but it was filmed in Thamesmead. And that was really a problem for Thamesmead, because it was filmed, I think, in 1972, so it was just a new area. And immediately it got this horrible image. It was the worst branding you could get by having this film made in this area. Well, anyway, if you know the movie, you can imagine the still that I had in the presentation. So this is the first block that we designed, also, let's say, on a more detailed level, an architectural project, where you can see how in a cluster of buildings, we're going too fast again, yeah? Yeah? We integrate, no? It's a bit naughty, the computer. So we have new townhouses, we have a new apartment building, but we also have the existing tower blocks and we integrate them in a new cluster. So the freestanding tower blocks that were in the original design, you know, just lost in space, become part of a more urban structure. Well, at the moment it's a bit unclear how the project will proceed, and that's due to the Brexit, because of course the expectations about the housing market and the profit that the market housing will bring in to build the affordable housing, because this first project is all about affordable housing. Well, that business model, let's say, is of course now under discussion. It's one of the many blessings of the Brexit thing. Good, I will wrap up. So, also as a kind of dessert, I still have a few minutes. Okay, yeah. Maybe taking out the main ideas or elements about this redevelopment and illustrating them with a few other projects that we did. So first, of course, it's very important if we look at, well, the housing crisis, but also the demand for housing and the expected growth of our cities, of London or Amsterdam, or name any successful city in Europe at the moment. I think we really have to look at what's already there, at the existing and often failing housing estates of the post-war period, and see how we can improve them by densifying them. Then also avoiding, of course, that we have to build again on the green open spaces that still surround our cities. So in a simple formula, think about redevelopment and densification. And this 300% densification idea sounds maybe extreme, but it's not, because the densities of these post-war housing areas are often extremely low, in fact. And it was also the strategy of the radical redevelopment of the Amsterdam post-war so-called Western garden cities, westelijke tuinsteden. And these are some projects I did there, and they're also based on this idea of a 300% densification. This is an example in Sloterdijk, and this is, I won't go explaining this kind of urban planning. You saw a little bit of it yesterday in Wojciech's presentation. It's a very Dutch way of planning, with these clusters of housing together forming a neighborhood unit where everybody in society can find a home. So low-rise housing, I'm still explaining it, for the elderly, then stair access flats for small families, you could say starters, and then here a larger gallery access flat with a bit more space for more settled, larger families. That was Dutch society after the Second World War. It was very simple. But now our society, of course, is much more complex, much more heterogeneous, multicultural. So it changed a lot. And for this area, a master plan was made, and it's quite typical for what happened. To demolish all these buildings, we really have a throwaway culture. At least we had it before the housing crisis. Demolish everything and build again. So these buildings were demolished, and then the density of the new buildings together was tripling. So we got a commission to build a new block here with 3 times the amount of the houses that were standing there. By doing that, we could replace all the existing, it was all social housing in one block, making the space of the 2 other blocks available for market housing. And with the profit of the market housing, the social housing or affordable housing was built. And this was done just in time before the credit crisis, because then this whole system collapsed in the Netherlands. But here it still worked. And we built this project. Of course, it's much higher, otherwise you cannot reach the tripled density, but still going not too high, 14 floors. And what you can also see that we tried, it's another aspect, I didn't Can you go back one? Yeah. Too much about architecture, but that we try to relate it to the existing buildings that were to be retained, kept. And they were all built in this typical post-war idiom of concrete and brick, often brick panels, prefab brick panels. So we try to make a new interpretation of the idea of prefabricated brick patterns, but now in a more cheerful way, not so like endless repeated bathroom tiles, but really making it a very varied facade in different color tones. And when you look at the housing types in the block, you can see more or less how our society changed, because this is not just for families or elderly couples, but there's an amazing variation of housing types within one block. And I think that's also a very important quality that I will in 1 minute show in another project. So it really varies from free floor maisonettes with 5 bedroom dwellings for large families to housing for the elderly, more regular family units, to very small one-room studios for people who need special care, either because they have mentally or physical restrictions. So it's again, this block, you could say, is a depiction of our society, but it shows how much more complex it has become. And here another image of our new brick panel interpretation. Then, a very important issue, I think, and we saw that also in the Thamesmead project, a double development. What I mean with that developments, and that is maybe less an architectural thing, but that's very much also a political thing, that you always should aim for a mix of market housing and affordable housing. That's the only way, if you, as a city, if you demand that from the developers, it's the only way to get it done. Because of course, in the end, the commercial developer is not interested in the affordable housing. But they have to make it. And for many years, in most of our cities, the rule was 70-30. So in a new development, 30% of the housing has to be affordable, has to be built for a housing corporation. But the last 4 or 5 years in Amsterdam, this has become even more extreme, because now we have the 40-40-20 rule, which means 40% of any large-scale housing development will be social housing. There are always exceptions, of course, but this is a general rule. It's decided by the municipal council. 40% social or affordable housing. No, let's say social housing, because that's rental housing owned by a housing corporation. 40% mid-market or affordable, which means that people with an average income should be able to live there. Also not really interesting for commercial developers, and only 20% free market. Here the developer can do what they want. This led, I must say, also to a small exodus of developers in Amsterdam, because they simply refuse to deal with these steps. But if you want to build, you have to. Oh, I did it again. Yeah? And as I said, I am in the dessert phase, so very quickly, how can you deal with these demands for this, you could say, quite extreme mix of housing categories? And at the moment, I'm working for the City of Amsterdam, for the Municipality of Amsterdam, for the City Planning Department, on studies for a new extension of the city, a new artificial island that will be created in the water. Maybe you're familiar with Eiburg. It's a whole archipelago of new islands. Based on the success of Soeter's Java Island project, the city decided to make again new islands and turn them into residential neighborhoods. And Eiburg so was, you could say, the follow-up of Java Island. And this is a plan of Eiburg. This part has already been built, is constructed. Then it stopped because of the housing crisis, but because the housing crisis is over, or probably back in a few years, but now it's over. And the city decided to continue with the Eiburg project, making these new islands. And they're all based on a kind of a quite simple idea of a grid pattern of streets that was already used in the first islands and will be repeated in the newer islands. But then they asked me to make a study. How can we make sure that within this simple grid pattern we get that variation of housing categories, but also a strong, let's say, urban quality and a variation in the buildings? How do we get to the right scale? How do we prevent this to become from a very monotonous housing environment, from a fence polder? And so that's what we try to study. And I think it's also quite related to things that Sjoerd showed before. So we defined a certain system of parcellation for these blocks. So they should never be developed in one go. Well, they could be designed in one go, but there's always at the basis a smaller scale. A scale is super important in housing design. So there's the parcel of 5 meters wide, which can accommodate just a townhouse or 2 townhouses on top of one another, or even a more dense configuration with houses at the back. You can have a parcel of 10 meters street front. There you can make a small project, a small cooperative project, because there's quite some demand for these small cooperatives. And then we said, okay, but the largest parcel is 20 meters wide, because in that you can build an apartment building in 4 or 5 floors with 25 to 30 apartments. And I think, more based on experience than really scientific knowledge, I must say, but we think that that's the perfect size for an apartment building. Not too big, not too small, but still a size that people feel connected to the place where they live and where they can together take care of their building. So we define this, let's say, as the basic elements for filling in these blocks of Eiburg, and then you can make an endless variation of configurations. You can also start off thinking having larger blocks, but still with their shape and how the way you repeat it, it will still be an interesting succession of open green courtyards facing the street facades, so that it will never be one big, very anonymous project. We, of course, related that also to housing types that we know from the past. So the townhouse, that is, you could say, the most flexible and adaptive building type that we know, because it can change from one house into an apartment building, into an office building, back into an apartment building, and so on and so forth. We looked at these larger configurations and precedents, and then in the end we defined with all these variations also 3 different spatial characters, because in the end, of course, it's also about creating spaces. Oops, yeah, one back, yeah, so this is a bit more dense in a smaller scale, this is more repetitive, and this is more individual buildings facing the new beach of this island. And we then explore that in sketches like this. And I think the scale of 5 to 6 floors, it's really the story of Sjoerd, with now and then maybe a small tower, creates high densities. It can compete with a high-rise development. And if you look very carefully, you can see in the middle a little boat, and this image I took in at the end of August when they started creating the land. And next year, when you visit Amsterdam, you can already lie on the beach that will be created here. It's going very fast. But it will take quite some years before we can start building, because the sand will be, compiled there to create the island, but then it takes years to subside, to sink to get to a stable level. Then, I'm really almost at the end. I've talked already a lot about mixing, and I think it's about mixing different housing types and categories in a project. And a beautiful example of that is, I think, the Funenpark project in Amsterdam. It's built on a master plan by Frits van Dongen, not by me, to be very clear, but we designed a couple of the housing of the buildings in this project. And I think it's a very interesting project, and maybe this could finally trigger some debate with Sjoerd, I don't know. What I like about it is that this is an interesting mix of a kind of traditional urbanism with, you could interpret it as a super block, a closed parameter block, but on the inside, it is more like the modernist ideal of living in a freestanding building in a green space, but combined in the heart of the city, the historic center of Amsterdam. It proved that it's quite successful and that it really works, because this creates a very good, let's say, living conditions for families, because of this green, car-free, very safe space. So this project proved, like Java Island, very successful in keeping families in a high-density project in our cities. And it's, as I said, it's a strong mix, because some of these blocks are social housing, but some are also clusters of really very substantial townhouses that cost like 1.5 million euro. So it's really the vice mayor of Amsterdam living next to people who live in social housing. And I think that's a very important quality that we should all aspire for, to have this mix in our projects. And in this project, it was not only, let's say, the mix of the different buildings, but even within the buildings, there's a very strong mix. This is a building we designed, and we had a brief that we had to make larger family units, but also small apartments for starters. And then we said, okay, then we make a kind of a sandwich. We design the family units as duplex housing, as maisonettes, because they really relate to, I think, what families want. Certainly in the Netherlands, they don't like the idea of an apartment. They want a house with a living room on the ground floor and bedrooms on top. And you can create that with the maisonette. And because of the master plan, the maisonettes on the ground floor, they have immediate access also to this collective green space. Then in the sandwich, we have the in-between layer of the small apartments, very small, but we gave them a very transparent facade so that it still also has a spacious character. And then on top, we again had to create family houses, and there we made 6 freestanding units. This was originally designed also for a housing corporation as affordable housing. And our client always liked this very much because he said, this is the ultimate ideal, because everybody wants to live in a freestanding villa in the middle of Amsterdam. And actually you can do that here, if you live in one of these maisonettes on the roof. And here you can see a typical Dutch interior in one of these units. So, to summarize, I think I addressed quite a few issues. In the end, I think it's very much about creating diversity and creating connections. It's about making space when we design, when we make housing neighborhoods, and not just filling up the leftover open space. And then I end as the real final dessert with a rather peculiar project, but it was put by you on the poster, so I thought I have to show it. This is certainly an example of a mixed project, because it's housing, it's offices, it's the Court of Justice of Amsterdam, it's a hotel. It's a project that, we designed as an urban project, as a master plan. So the buildings themselves were designed by different architects, but the project was to create a master plan for a number of buildings along the river edge In fact, here you see Java Island, the project Sjoerd Soeter showed. So we are now on the other side of the main river, the IJ of Amsterdam, and here you can see Central Railway Station. And so there were a lot of initiatives for buildings on this western side, but our first analysis was if you put all these houses along the quayside, you block the view from the road, because you only give the view to the people who will work and live in the building. So we said, okay, we combine all these intended projects into one cluster of buildings, so we can leave the rest of the quayside here open. And then we started to design not the buildings, but the open space, or you could say the connecting spaces. So by identifying view lines from the existing city, like this one, going through the street, it continues through the project to this iconic tower. And we defined a number of view lines. This very crazy one, we call it the canyon, was defined by a view from the historic town center. And we also defined some new ones to create new view lines. So you can see that here. So it's in Dutch, I'm sorry, but it shows the point of departure. It's the red volume. And we knew we only had to build half of that red volume. So we could make all these cutouts. And the result was 5 individual buildings, each with their own individual shape. Yeah, I'm really almost done. But together they also form one building. And here you can see the result when it was finally built. It took 15 years, but it was built. And so you can read it as one building, but also as a set of buildings, each with their own functions, also housing. And with creating these view lines, you also create a kind of miniature townscaping in this project. And of course we had a lot of discussion because some of these view lines in the end resulted in very weird shapes, but that was also the fun. So in the end we ended up of having an apartment here of 8 floors, because the floors are so small in that very sharp angle that it was the only way to build a house. And the client thought, that's crazy, we're not going to do that. But it was the first apartment he sold, because who doesn't want to own a unique apartment and not an apartment that is repeated 2,000 times. I really have to stop now, I know, so I think this is the final image. Thank you.